The first frost of the season had silvered the gravel of Wexcombe Court when the old man came to the gate on foot, and the woman who watched him from the long window did not at first know him, because the last time she had seen his face she had been 6 years old. He stood beyond the iron hat in his hands, the wind pulling at a coat that had once been good and was now merely careful. A footman had gone out to him and come back uncertain. "A baronet," the footman said, "who would give no card, and asked for no one by title. Only for the lady of the house. Only for a moment of her time. Only that." The lady of the house set down her pen. Through the glass, she observed the way he held his shoulders, the particular bow of a man who had spent his strength being certain and had run out of it, and something in her chest folded shut like a fan. She knew that bow. She had seen it across a breakfast table the morning her mother was buried. Her name was Verity, and the house behind her was not yet hers in law, though it would be by spring. To the county she had become a figure of quiet consequence, the woman whose ledgers were exact, whose tenants did not starve in hard winters, whose word the Duke of Wexcombe was said to weigh before his own stewards. To the man at the gate she had been for the better part of 30 years, an absence he had arranged and then declined to remember. Let me set the scene plainly, because the shape of it matters. A daughter does not forget the day she is given away. She only learns to carry it where it cannot be seen. She did not go down to him at once. She finished the column of figures she had been adding, and she blotted it, and she watched her own hand to be sure it was steady, and only then did she ring for her cloak. To begin properly we must go back, past the frost and the gate and the Duke whose name the county attached to hers, to a house called Carrowmore Hall, and a man who wanted a son the way other men wanted heir. Sir Edmund Carrowmore had married for an heir and been answered with daughters, 3 of them, one after another, in a span of years that turned his mouth harder with each christening. Verity was the eldest, then Susanna with her mother's gentleness, then little Beatrice who came too early and cost their mother her life, and was for that never quite forgiven. The estate of Carrowmore was held under an entail that passed only through the male line, and Sir Edmund had no male line, and the law that should have been a fence had become for him a sentence read aloud at every meal. He grieved his wife. That much was true and must be granted him. He grieved the son she had failed to give him more. Then he grieved the wife herself, and the grief curdled and the curdling found 3 small targets near at hand. What he did within the law and within the customs of his class, which is the cruelty of it. He did not turn his daughters into the cold. He sent them away. Verity and Susanna were placed with a distant cousin in the north, a hard and respectable woman named Mrs. Ellersby, who took the small allowance Sir Edmund sent and resented every shilling of it. Beatrice, being an infant, went to a wet nurse in the village of Pendle Cross, and then, when the allowance for her was quietly stopped, into the keeping of the parish. Sir Edmund meanwhile set himself to securing a male heir by any door the law would open. He petitioned for the entail to be broken. He courted a young widow with sons. He spent years and a great deal of money chasing a boy who would carry the Carrowmore name forward into a future that did not, in his arithmetic, require his daughters to exist in it. Verity was 6 when the carriage took her north. She remembered the smell of the leather and the back of the coachman's neck, and her father standing on the steps growing smaller, not waving. She remembered thinking he would call them back before the gate. He did not call them back at the gate. He did not call them back at all. What she did not yet know, jolting north in that cold carriage with her sister's hand in hers, was that the cousin who received them would prove to be the making of her, and that the man who had discarded her would one day stand at a frosted gate, old and on foot, begging for her notice. The north did not soften them. Mrs. Ellersby ran a respectable establishment for the daughters of gentlemen who could not, for one reason or another, keep their own girls, and she ran it on the principle that gratitude was the only proper sentiment a charity child might own. Verity learned quickly that tares were taxed and that competence was rewarded, and she became competent the way other children became devout, with her whole frightened heart. She learned figures because the housekeeper let her sit by the fire if she made herself useful. With the account she learned to read a contract, to keep a still face, to ask for nothing she had not first earned the right to ask for. She kept her sisters with her by main force of will. Susanna was sent for at 14 to be a companion to an invalid lady in Bath, and Verity wrote to her every week without fail for 11 years, so that the bond never thinned. Beatrice, she lost for a time and found again, and the finding of Beatrice is its own thread, and I will not drop it. When Mrs. Seddix's Ellersby died, she left Verity, of all people, the establishment, and the small capital behind it, because Verity was the only soul who had ever made the books balance, and the only one the old woman had ever, in her dry way, trusted. Verity was 23. She did not weep at the funeral. She went home and opened the ledgers and found the place nearer ruin than anyone had known, and over the next 9 years, she did not merely save it, she built from it. She took the capital and she lent it carefully, and she bought a failing mill and made it pay. And she bought the freehold of 2 farms whose tenants the gentry had let go to rot, and she made them yield. She did it quietly, through agents, because a woman of business is a scandal, and a woman of business who succeeds is a worse one, and she had learned long ago to be invisible, until the moment invisibility ceased to serve her. By the autumn of her 32nd year she held, in her own name and in trust, a competence that would have astonished the father who had decided she was worth nothing. She had a house she had taken on a long lease, Hartfield Grange, a stone manor in the valley below Wexcombe Court, and it was there over a question of a flooded water meadow that lay between his land and her lease that she first met the Duke of Wexcombe. His name was Adrian, and he was not what the county said he was. The county said he was cold. They said the Duke of Wexcombe had buried a wife and a brother in the same year, and had come back from the burying with a face like stone over a winter river, and that he attended what he must, and danced with no one, and spoke to women only when address could not be avoided. They said his heart had gone into the ground with the 2 coffins, and that the dukedom had got a steward where it should have had a man. This was the settled verdict of the neighborhood, and it suited Adrian to let it stand. He rode down to the flooded meadow himself, which surprised her, expecting to find a tenant's complaint, and finding instead a tall woman in a plain gray cloak standing in the wet grass with the surveyor's chain in her gloved hands, taking the measure of the water for herself. He was tall and broad through the shoulder, dark-haired with a jaw that the county mistook for hardness and a pair of gray eyes that missed nothing. He looked at the chain in her hands and at the careful line of her mouth, and he did not ask her where her husband was, which was the first thing nearly every man asked her, and the not asking was the first thing she ever liked about him. The matter of the meadow was settled between them in a quarter of an hour fairly, with a small concession on each side that left them both faintly the better. He offered her his hand to cross the boggy ground back to the lane. She took it. His grip was firm and brief and entirely correct, and he released her at the lane and bowed and rode away, and she stood watching the rain come on over the hills, and was annoyed with herself for noticing the warmth of his hand through 2 gloves. That should have been the end of it. A duke and a leaseholder have no occasion to meet. The parish of Marwood was small, however, and the winter was hard, and a hard winter brings the gentry and the people of business into the same rooms, whether the gentry like it or not. There was a family of weavers in Pendle Cross whose looms had failed, and there was a question of relief, and the question came before a committee of the principal residents at the Marwood Assembly Rooms on a grey afternoon in November. Verity attended because the weavers were her tenants and she would not see them left to the parish. The Duke of Wexcombe attended because the living of Pendle Cross was in his gift and the rector had asked him. And the Dowager Countess of Ravenglass attended because she attended everything, and because she had decided, in the way that powerful old women decide such things, that the cold Duke of Wexcombe was the proper match for her granddaughter, and that any obstacle to that match was to be removed before it had finished forming. Her name was Lady Hester, and she was the 3rd force ranged against the heroine's quiet rise, and she was not a fool. That is the thing to understand about her. She was small and upright and beautifully dressed in deep mourning gray that she wore as a permanent costume of consequence, with white hair dressed high and rings on fingers that had buried 2 earls. She had spent 60 years protecting the order she had been raised inside. And she protected it the way a good general defends a border, with intelligence and patience, and an unsentimental willingness to spend whatever the defense required. She saw that first afternoon 2 things that the rest of the room did not. She saw the way the Duke of Wexcombe's gaze went to the woman in the gray cloak when the woman spoke about the weaver's looms, and stayed a half-second past what courtesy required. And she saw that the woman in the gray cloak did not know she had been looked at, which made it worse, because a woman who does not yet know is a woman who has not yet decided, and an undecided thing can still be turned. To the assembly, Lady Hester named her in a low, pleasant voice to the rector's wife, loud enough to carry a tradeswoman, she called Verity. Verity. A person of some property, no doubt, and very forward, but one did not quite know where such people had come from, and it was a pity the committee should be troubled with them. The rector's wife murmured agreement. Verity heard it, kept her face still, and finished her account of the weaver's looms in a voice that did not shake, and the relief was granted, and that was the first of 3 times the same dismissal would be spoken aloud over her, each in a different room, each meant to put her back in a place she had long since left. She told no one it had stung. She told no one anything. Adrian, watching from across the room, saw the small flinch she did not let reach her face, the way her thumb pressed once against the seam of her glove and went still, and he marked it. And he marked the old woman who had caused it, and he said nothing at all, which the county would have read as coldness, and which was in fact the most careful kind of attention. Well, if you have ever been the person spoken of in the third person while standing close enough to hear, you know the particular silence that follows. Verity knew it well. She had been hearing it since she was 6. She gathered her papers and went home to Hartfield Grange and did her accounts by candlelight, and did not think about the Duke of Wexcombe at all, which is to say she thought about him with great determination for most of the night. The winter drew them together by inches, against the will of both. There was the matter of a road that wanted mending, and a dispute over commons' rights that she settled more justly than the magistrates would have, and a sick child in one of his villages, whose mother came to Verity, because Verity was known to be sensible about fevers, and would not stand on ceremony at a cottage door. Adrian found himself again and again in rooms where she was, and he began to understand that he arranged it, and the understanding alarmed him, for he had a wound, and the wound had a shape, and the shape was this. The wife he had buried had been chosen for him, gently and with every good intention, by people who loved him, and she had been a kind young woman who deserved better than a husband whose heart had not been consulted, and she had died bearing a child who did not live. And Adrian had stood at 2 gravesides in 1 year, and understood that he had let the world arrange his life for him, and that the arrangement had cost a good woman everything. He had resolved, in the cold place that grief leaves behind, that he would never again let his rank choose for him, and that he would never again offer a woman a heart he could not honestly give. He mistook this for a long while as a resolution never to love. It was in truth a resolution never to lie. He did not yet know the difference. He learned it slowly, in a gray cloak, by a flooded meadow, over a winter of small, honest dealings with a woman who wanted nothing from him that he had been born to, and everything from him that he had earned. The thread of Beatrice I promised not to drop, and here it returns. The youngest sister, lost to the parish at Pendle Cross, had not died, as Verity had half feared through the worst years. She had been taken in by the very weaver whose looms now failed, raised as a foster child, grown to a quiet, capable woman of 29, who kept the weaver's accounts and did not know her own name had ever been Carrowmore. Verity found her in the course of the Relief Committee's work, recognized in the shape of her hands and the set of her brow the mother all 3 of them had lost, made certain through the parish register and an old midwife's memory, and brought her sister home without fanfare, the way she did everything. And the 3 daughters of Sir Edmund Carrowmore were under one roof again. For the first time since the carriage went north, they did not speak of their father. There seemed nothing to say. What Verity did not know, that quiet spring, was that her father had at last learned where she was and what she had become, and that the knowing had set in motion the slow journey that would end at a frosted gate. Sir Edmund's long campaign for an heir had failed. The widow with sons had married another. The petition to break the entail had been refused, and refused again, and the lawyer's fees had eaten the loose capital, and then the harvest had failed 3 years running, and the man who had given away 3 daughters to secure a bloodline found himself old and ill in a house he could no longer keep, with the entail still passing, by the cruel symmetry of the law, to a distant male cousin he had never met, and who was waiting, not without impatience, for him to die. Carrowmore Hall would go to a stranger, the name would go forward without him in it. He had spent everything, including his children, on a future that had quietly closed its door in his face. It was the cousin's man of business who told him, almost idly, that the Lanyon woman whose ventures had lately been the talk of 3 counties was none other than his own eldest daughter, kept under her mother's maiden name by the cousin in the north. Sir Edmund had not heard the name spoken in 30 years. He sat a long while after the man of business had gone. Then he wrote a letter, and the letter was returned unopened, because Verity had given her household standing orders before she could be tempted to give them in a weaker moment. So he came himself, an old man on foot, to the frosted gate of Wexcombe Court, asking the footman for the lady of the house. She went down to him. She had decided she would, somewhere between the column of figures and the ringing for her cloak, because she was not a woman who left a thing unfaced, and because some part of her that was still 6 years old needed to see the gate from the inside this time. He had grown small in earnest now, not merely with distance. The wind had got into him. He looked at her and his face worked, and he said her name, the name he had given her and then declined to keep. And he said it as a question, as if he were not sure he had the right. She said, "My name is Verity Lanyon." She said it level and clear, the way she said figures she would not let be argued. She did not say it cruelly. She only declined to be unsure of who she was in front of, the man who had once been unsure she was worth keeping. He had come, he said, because he was dying, and because the hall was lost, and because he had wronged her, all 3 at once, and tumbling, and Verity stood in the cold and understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that he had arranged the 3 reasons in the order of their importance to him, and that the wronging of her came third. She felt the old fan-fold shut in her chest again. She did not strike him with it. She invited him in because the wind was bitter and he was an old man, and she was not the kind of woman her father had made of himself. What followed over the next weeks was not a reconciliation, because reconciliation requires 2 who wish it, and only one of the 2 at Hartfield Grange wished anything but rescue. Sir Edmund settled into a guest room and began by slow degrees to behave as a man behaves who believes a debt is about to be paid. He spoke of the hall as though Verity might buy it back and restore him to it. He spoke of the family name as though it were a treasure he was generously offering to let her share in again. He met Susanna, who was civil and wary, and Beatrice, whom he did not at first recognize, and then, on being told, regarded with a flicker of something that was not quite shame, and not quite calculation, but partook of both, because Beatrice's existence was the proof of his worst single act, and a dying man does not love the proof of his worst act. Verity watched it all and added her columns, and said little. She had not decided what she would do. She knew only that she would not be hurried, and that no one, least of all the father who had taught her the lesson, would make her decision for her. It was into this house that the Dowager Countess of Ravenglass now turned the full weight of her attention, for she had not been idle. Lady Hester had learned, as she learned everything, that the Duke of Wexcombe's interest in the Lanyon woman had not cooled with the winter but deepened with the spring, and she had decided the time for low, pleasant words in assembly rooms was past. She would not have her granddaughter's duke thrown away on a tradeswoman of no birth and dubious origin, and she had discovered, through patient inquiry, exactly how dubious that origin might be made to appear. She knew now of Sir Edmund. She knew of the 3 daughters given away. She knew of the youngest, lost to the parish. And she saw in that history not a tragedy to be pitied but a weapon to be aimed. For nothing destroys a woman of risen fortune so surely as the revelation that her family had thrown her in the gutter, and that she had clawed up from it by means the gentry would prefer not to examine. She arranged a card party at Ravenglass, a large one, and she contrived that the Duke of Wexcombe should attend, and she contrived that Verity should be invited too, in a gesture of apparent condescension that the whole county read as a softening, and that was in truth the setting of the table. Her granddaughter, Lady Lucasta, was placed near the Duke at every turn. Lady Lucasta was 24, fair and finished and faultlessly schooled, and she had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice, and she believed it with the serene confidence of a person who has never once been wrong about her own worth because no one has ever dared to tell her. She was not cruel. That is worth saying. She had simply never met a circumstance in which her cruelty would have been required, and she did not know what she would do if she met one. The trap was sprung at supper. Lady Hester, with the whole company attending, turned to Verity in a voice of warm inquiry, and asked after her family and her people, and the place she came from, and she asked it the way a hunter asks a bird to fly. She wished, she said sweetly, that everyone might know dear Mrs. Lanyon better, for she was such a mystery, and one did so like to know where one's new neighbors had sprung from. There was a small laugh somewhere down the table. And then, before Verity could shape a single careful word, Lady Hester answered her own question gently, devastatingly, with the whole history laid out as concern. The baronet father. The 3 daughters sent away because they were not sons, the youngest left to the parish like a foundling. And here, the old woman paused, let the silence do the cutting, and said that of course no one held against dear Mrs. Lanyon the circumstances of her birth, only that one understood now why she had been obliged to go into trade, poor creature having been left with nothing and no one, and was it not remarkable what such a person might accomplish, given a little hard fortune and a great deal of determination? It was the second voicing of the dismissal in the largest room, before the most witnesses, and it was meant to be the last word ever needed on the subject of who Verity was. The table waited. Sir Edmund, who had come along in his daughter's train and now sat exposed as the architect of the very abandonment being recited, went grey, and said nothing, his hand shaking on the stem of his glass, and Verity understood in that instant that her father would not defend her, had never defended her, would let the whole company believe whatever spared him most, and that this, finally, was the truest thing he had ever shown her about himself. She set down her own glass. The room had decided, in the space of a sentence, that she was a foundling tradeswoman elevated by accident above her station, and she could feel the decision settling over her like cold water, the same dismissal she had heard in the assembly rooms, and, before that, in a cousin's parlor in the north, and, before all of it, too, I knew the silence of a father who did not call her back at the gate. And then the Duke of Wexcombe rose from his place unhurried, and the small motion of his rising stopped the room. He did not raise his voice. He had never in his life raised his voice, and he did not begin now. He crossed the floor to where Verity sat, in front of the dowager and the granddaughter and the rector's wife and the whole staring company, and he stood beside her chair, and he said, his voice level, that he believed Mrs. Lanyon had been the most accomplished person in any room he had entered this 12-month, and that the manner of a family's beginnings reflected upon the family, and not upon the child. It had wronged, and that he, for one, did not require a person to inherit their worth, having met a great many who had inherited everything but it. A long breath of silence held the table. Lady Hester's face did not move, but her rings caught the candlelight as her hand closed. Adrian looked down at Verity then, and used her given name, deliberately, for the first time, so that the whole room heard him claim the right to it. Verity, he said. And then he said the thing he had crossed the room to say, the thing he had not foreshadowed and would not repeat, 11 words long, and irrevocable. I mean to marry her if she will have me. The room did not gasp. It did something quieter and more total. It rearranged itself. For the verdict of a duke, spoken plainly in the house of a dowager countess, in front of the granddaughter that dowager had meant him for, was not a thing the county could pretend it had not heard. And every soul at that table understood at once that the question of who Verity Lanyon was had just been answered by the highest authority present, and answered in her favor, and that the old woman at the head of the table had overplayed her hand had been seen to do it. Lady Hester was not yet beaten. This is the part the county did not expect and would tell wrongly for years. She did not fragment at the first blow because she had not survived 60 years at the head of tables by fragmenting. She gathered herself in the held silence, and she answered the Duke, not with anger, which would have looked like defeat, but with the one weapon she still believed unanswerable, the weapon of the law and the world, as they actually were. She said gently still that his grace was generous, as the great could afford to be, but that generosity did not alter a settlement, and that she wondered whether his grace had considered what the world would say of a duke, who married a woman of trade whose own father had judged her unfit to keep, and whether the children of such a match would thank him, and whether the dukedom itself, with all its dependence and its history, was his grace's. To spend upon a sentiment, she had moved the ground from Verity's birth, where she had been beaten, to Verity's fitness to be a duchess, where she believed no one could beat her, and she had done it in a breath, and several heads at the table nodded slowly because she had named the real fear, the one that lived under the manners, and naming it was a kind of power. It was a true counter, and a strong one, and it would have ended a lesser woman. Verity rose. She had not meant to speak. She had meant to let Adrian's words stand, and to withdraw with what dignity the evening had left her. The dowager, though, had asked, in effect, what such a woman as Verity could possibly bring to a dukedom but scandal, and Verity had spent 30 years answering exactly that question, with her whole life, and she found she would answer it once more here, plainly, for the only time it would ever need answering. She did not defend her birth. She did not weep or accuse her father, who sat gray and silent and made no sound. She spoke instead, in the level voice she used for figures that would not be argued, of the things she had done. She named the mill at Pendle Cross that had been failing, and now employed 40 families, and she named the 2 farms the gentry had let rot, and the tenants now thriving on them. And she named without raising her voice weavers whose relief this very dowager's committee had nearly refused, and whom Verity had carried through the winter from her own purse. She said that she had managed, alone, with no name and no settlement and no one to consult, a concern larger than many an estate, and brought it through 3 bad harvests without turning off a single family or breaking a single promise, and that she had learned what a dependent was owed not from a history book but from being one. She said that if the worth of a duchess lay in her care for those who depended upon her, then she would set her account against any lady at the table and abide the reckoning. And then she stopped because she had said, enough, and a thing, well said, does not need saying twice. The silence after that was of a wholly different kind. The heads that had nodded for the dowager were still now, for Lady Hester had asked what Verity could bring to the dukedom, and Verity had answered with a competence that every landed soul at that table privately knew their own affairs lacked, and the answer could not be unheard. The dowager had aimed at Verity's fitness, and Verity had met the charge not with protest but with proof, demonstrated and specific and impossible to wave away. And the demonstration had humbled the old woman more completely than any anger could have, because it had beaten her on the very ground she had chosen and trusted. Lady Hester looked at Verity for a long moment. She was not a stupid woman, and she had spent her life judging worth, even if her instruments were wrong, and she recognized, in the level voice and the unanswerable account, a quality her own granddaughter did not possess and never would, and the recognition cost her something visible. Her shoulders, which had been upright for 60 years, settled a half-inch. She inclined her head, the smallest possible motion, the concession of a general who knows the field is lost and will not waste lives pretending otherwise. She said, only in a voice from which the sweetness had at last gone, leaving something almost like respect that she had perhaps been misinformed, and that his grace must of course follow his own judgment, and that she found herself fatigued. She rose, and the party was, by the iron custom, of her own authority. Over, she was not destroyed. She was corrected. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole of this kind of story. She withdrew to her own rooms with her dignity, battered but intact, and within the year she would receive Verity, once, stiffly, and find to her own surprise that she did not dislike her, and that is as near to an apology as a woman like Lady Hester ever comes. Lady Lucasta, who had sat through the whole of it saying nothing, looked at the Duke who had been meant for her, and at the woman he had crossed her room for, and she understood, perhaps, for the first time in her finished and faultless life, that being the correct choice and being the chosen one were not the same thing, and that no one had ever told her so. She was not cruel. She wished them, in a small, uncertain voice as the company broke up. Very happy. It was the bravest thing she had ever done, and no one but Verity noticed it. And Verity, who knew what it cost to say a generous thing in a room that has just rearranged itself against you, gave her a look of something like kindness in return. There remained the matter of Sir Edmund. He came to Verity the next morning at Hartfield Grange before the frost had melted from the lawns, and he was eager now, almost trembling, for he had seen his daughter claimed by a duke, and his own fortunes, he believed, restored at the very edge of the grave. He spoke of the wedding and of the hall, and of how the family might be made whole. And he used the word family as though he had any claim to it, and he asked, at the last, in a voice gone thin with need, whether she would not buy back Carrowmore, and let him end his days in the house his fathers had held, and let the name go forward after all. Verity heard him out. She did not interrupt. When he had finished, she was quiet a while, and then she spoke, and what she said was the hardest thing she had ever said to him, and the gentlest, and they were the same thing. She told him she would not let him want. She would settle on him a competence sufficient to his comfort and his care, and she would see that he was nursed and warm and decently buried, because she was not the man he had been and would not leave even him to the parish. She would not buy back Carrowmore, however, and she would not carry forward the name that had been taken from her, and she would not pretend, to spare a dying man, that the gate had not closed 30 years ago with all 3 of his daughters on the wrong side of it. She had a family, she told him. It was upstairs. At that moment 2 sisters she had kept by main force, across 30 years and 1,000 miles, and had owed its survival to nothing he had ever done and everything he had failed to. She would care for him as a Christian woman cares for the poor at her door. She would not call him father, because the word named a thing that had not happened, and she had spent her whole life refusing to pretend that things had happened which had not. Sir Edmund wept, then, whether for himself, or for her, or for the 30 wasted years, it is not given to us to know, and Verity did not ask, because she had stopped, somewhere in the night, needing to know what her father felt. 2. He lived 8 months more, in comfort, attended, and he died in the spring with Verity in the room, because she had said she would see him decently buried, and she was a woman who kept her word, even to those who had broken theirs. And she held his hand at the end, not because he had earned it, but because she had decided long ago what kind of woman she would be, and that decision had never once depended on him. She married Adrian at the parish church of Marwood on a morning in early summer, quietly, with her 2 sisters standing up with her and the weavers of Pendle Cross lining the lane, and the Duke of Wexcombe, who the county had sworn would never love again, was seen by the whole parish to smile, just once, at the church door when his wife took his arm, and the county revised its long-settled verdict on him in the space of that single smile, and never afterward called him cold. The Dowager Countess of Ravenglass sent a wedding gift. It was a small thing and a correct one, and it came without a card, which those who knew her understood to be the loudest thing she could have said. I will tell you how it ended, and then I will let it rest. If Verity's long road from a cold carriage to a church door has stayed with you, Hold it a moment before you go on. The frost came again that autumn to Wexcombe Court, the same first silver frost on the same gravel where this began, and on that morning the new Duchess of Wexcombe walked out alone before the house was awake, as had become her habit, to take the measure of the day. She stopped at the iron gate where her father had stood the year before with his hat in his hands. She looked at it a while, the cold metal, the white grass beyond, the lane running down toward the valley, and the stone manor she had built her fortune from, and the villages she had carried through the hard winters. From the house behind her, she could hear, very faint, her sister Susanna at the pianoforte, a phrase begun and left hanging the way Susanna always left it, to be finished later, when there was time. And now at last there was time. She did not go out through the gate. She had no more need of gates. She turned, with the frost crisp under her boots, and the music drifting thin across the lawn, and she walked back up toward the warm house and the people in it who were hers, because she had chosen them, and they had chosen her, which is the only belonging that had ever been worth the name. Behind her the gate stood open on the cold lane, and she left it open, because there was no longer anyone she needed to keep out, and no one at all she needed to wait for. And the morning was very still, and the unfinished phrase came once more across the grass and, this time, went on.